Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really foundational question about the United States.
A big one.
A very big one. Was the U.S. Constitution built on those sort of general Western Enlightenment ideals we all learn about, or was it rooted in something much more specific, a set of Judeo-Christian principles?
That's the tension right there. And for this, we're pulling from some fascinating source material, mainly a summary of work by Charlie Kirk with commentary from Louis B. Vega.
And what's interesting is that this material, it doesn't just present a theory. It directly confronts the counter-narrative you hear all the time.
Right. The idea that the U.S. was founded on common law, that the Constitution doesn't mention God, so it must be secular, and, the Declaration only gives God a passing mention maybe 4 times.
Okay, so let's unpack this because here's where it gets really interesting. The source material argues you can't just look at the Constitution by itself.
No, that's a mistake.
Yeah.
You have to look at what the United States was at the time, a collection of states and colonies. The federal document came later.
So the argument really starts with the state constitutions.
Exactly. That's where, according to the sources, you see the real spiritual and legal reality of the founding era.
And when you do look at those state documents, the requirements for holding public office are, well, they're not what you'd expect today.
Not at all. The source claims that 13 out of 13 of the original states required a formal declaration of faith to serve in government.
A mandatory legal requirement.
A mandatory requirement. And it gets more specific. 9 of those 13 states required you to be a Protestant.
And the exception being Maryland, which was Catholic, but they still had that Declaration of Faith rule, right?
They still required it, yes. And to really drive this home, they give a great example. Pennsylvania. Its original state constitution had a line something like, "I profess Lord and Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior."
Wow. That's incredibly specific.
It is. And it's used as evidence that political authority was, deeply tied to very specific theological beliefs right at the moment of founding.
So that's the law. What about the people? The source also makes this really bold claim about the signers of the Declaration of Independence.
It does. It says 55 out of the 56 signers were Bible-believing, church-attending Christians.
Which then feeds into another fascinating piece of research they present about what these founders were actually reading and quoting.
Yeah, this is maybe one of the most surprising claims. If you ask people what the intellectual foundation was, what book was most cited?
You'd say John Locke, Montesquieu, maybe Blackstone for the legal stuff. That's what we're all taught.
That's what makes this so jarring. According to their research, the most quoted book more than any of those philosophers was Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy, from the Old Testament.
Yes. Moses' farewell address.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's a book of laws, customs, traditions, a blueprint for a civil society.
And the claim is that was quoted more than Locke or Blackstone.
More than all of them. Which, if true, suggests the founders were modeling their new nation on, well, a very specific religious legal code, not just abstract philosophy.
Okay, but that raises a huge question. The common argument is that our legal system is based on common law, which is seen as a secular tradition. How does the source handle that?
They argue that common law itself isn't secular. They say it's fundamentally an outgrowth of Scripture.
How so?
Well, they trace it back to Sir William Blackstone, who they point out was a Christian. And they basically assert that common law is the practical application of biblical morality.
So concepts we think of as purely legal, like fairness, they're arguing, are actually theological.
Precisely. They list 3 big ones: the presumption of innocence,
Okay.
due process, and the right to a jury of your peers.
I mean, that's the foundation of what we call blind justice.
And they connect it directly to that idea, pointing to Leviticus 19, which says, "You shall not favor justice if you are rich or poor."
So impartiality.
Right. And what's really insightful in their analysis is the context. That command for blind justice comes right before the more famous line, "You should love your neighbor as yourself."
So you need the fair legal system first as a foundation before you can even get to the societal love and charity part.
That's the argument. And they do the same thing with human equality. They say it's not just an Enlightenment idea. Its ultimate source is the New Testament ideal. Neither slave, nor Greek, nor Jew, you are all one in Jesus Christ.
Okay, so that brings us back to the founding documents themselves. Let's talk about the Declaration again. The criticism is that it only mentions God 4 times.
Right, but the source sees those 4 mentions as incredibly important.
Yeah.
They point to Creator, nature's God, but they really zero in on the last sentence.
The part where they appeal to the supreme judge of the universe.
Exactly. They argue that title Supreme Judge is a direct reference to Jesus Christ from the book of Revelation. So in their view, the signers were actually praying.
They were ending the document with a prayer.
A very specific prayer to Christ. They saw it as a spiritual covenant, not just a political document.
That view of the Declaration really sets up their whole perspective on the Constitution's purpose. And this leads to that really powerful quote from John Adams.
Yes, this is central to their whole thesis.
Hmm.
Adams is quoted as saying the Constitution was only written for moral and religious people. It was wholly inadequate for the people of any other.
That's a stunning statement. The idea that the whole system only works if the people have a certain moral character.
It's conditional. It assumes a pre-existing internal restraint, a religious self-restraint. If that's gone, the source argues the whole structure, all the checks and balances, they can't hold.
And I think the most compelling physical evidence they bring up is the Liberty Bell,
Ah, yeah.
the inscription. If the founders were just deists believing in some distant clockmaker god, why pick a quote from Leviticus?
Exactly. Proclaim liberty throughout the land. It's from Leviticus 25. The source says, think about that. Not Psalms, not Proverbs, not John. Leviticus, a dense book of ancient Hebrew law.
It's not a casual choice.
They say it's definitive proof of a deep, specific theological grounding. This all comes down to their core idea about law itself. There's no such thing as neutral morality.
Right. All laws have to come from some moral framework.
And for the founding generation, that framework was the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. That was the core morality, which is why, they argue, it was historically placed in Congress and the Supreme Court.
Okay, that is the perfect transition to the elephant in the room, the separation of church and state. The source is adamant that phrase is not in the Constitution.
Not anywhere. They trace it to a single letter.
Written by Thomas Jefferson in 1802.
1802, yes, to the Danbury Baptist Convention. And the source argues the whole point of the letter has been flipped on its head.
What was the original point, according to them?
Jefferson was trying to reassure the Baptists, who are a minority, that the federal government would not create a national church that would then come after them. It was a wall of protection for the church, not a wall to keep religion out of public life.
So the opposite of how it's often used today.
The complete opposite. And they claim this obscure letter was basically ignored until, as they put it was resurrected by the Warren Burger Court in the 60s and made to seem like it was part of the Constitution.
We should probably just remind everyone what is actually in the First Amendment.
Good point. 2 clauses.
Yeah.
The Establishment Clause and the Free Expression Clause.
And the source's interpretation is that the Establishment Clause was just about preventing a national state-run religion, right? Like the Church of England.
Exactly. They were worried about, say, a Presbyterian or Anglican church taking over the federal government. They claim it was never intended to banish religious expression from the public square.
And they use some pretty powerful historical examples to back this up.
They do. For instance, they claim one of the very first acts of Congress was to use taxpayer money to print and distribute Bibles.
That would be controversial today.
To say the least.
Yeah.
And get this, they also point out that church services were regularly held inside the Supreme Court building.
Inside the Supreme Court.
In the U.S. Capitol, as late as the 1820s under President Jackson. The point being, the lived reality of the early republic was one where faith and government were deeply intertwined.
Okay. So we've laid out the historical and legal claims. Now we need to shift to the final part of their argument, the implications for today. And we should be clear, we're now moving into the source's direct analysis and warnings, which are very strongly worded.
Yes. This is where they present what they call the incompatibility crisis. The argument is simple. If the government was designed as a Christian form of government, but the nation is no longer predominantly Christian,
then the system and the people are no longer compatible.
right. And their warning is stark. Liberty, as defined by the Constitution, cannot exist without a Christian population to uphold it.
And if that link is broken, what's the outcome?
The nation can't survive.
Yeah.
Not socially, not economically. It collapses once it leaves those Judeo-Christian principles behind.
And the source claims this isn't just happening by accident.
No, they are very clear on this. They state this division is intentional and deliberate, calculated by what they call the Luciferian of the world elite. In this view, Christians are the restraining force that is being actively targeted and neutralized.
They then connect this idea to what they call Marxist socialist decay.
Yes, and they claim this decay is the cause of recent violence and conflict, which they attribute to anti-American and anti-Christian sentiment being taught in universities.
So the prognosis here is pretty grim.
It is. The source predicts that, barring some kind of massive national revival, what awaits is divine judgment. They even mention a specific theological event, the rapture reset, which they say will bring chaos. The final takeaway is that the country's political health is failing because its moral foundation has been destroyed.
That is a very specific and profound conclusion from the source material. To just try and recap this deep dive has offered a really powerful alternative to the standard telling of American history.
It really has. From the Declarations of Faith and State Constitution to Deuteronomy being the most quoted book.
And that detail about Leviticus on the Liberty Bell is it's one of those things that really makes you stop and think.
It does. And we also covered their claim about the separation of church and state, that it comes from one Jefferson letter from 1802, meant to protect the church, and was only reinterpreted by the Supreme Court in the 1960s.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this? This source material makes a very firm argument that the U.S. Constitution's survival depends on the people sharing a specific religious morality, the Decalogue.
And that leaves us with a really important question for you to think about. If the source is right, if all laws are a reflection of some kind of morality and a truly neutral morality isn't possible, then what core moral framework does a diverse modern society need to agree on for any government, any system of liberty to actually work?
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.